Ethel Skakel Kennedy, an icon of strength and tragedy in American history, wife of Robert F. Kennedy, mother of 11 children, and the woman who transformed personal pain into a driving force for global justice. Born in 1928 into a wealthy but turbulent family, Ethel met RFK through his sister, married in 1950, and stood by his side through political peaks, from advising JFK to serving as Attorney General, then Senator. But her life was shattered by JFK's assassination in 1963, followed by RFK's in 1968, while she was pregnant with their youngest child. Undeterred, Ethel founded the RFK Center for Justice and Human Rights, joined protests against the Vietnam War, supported civil rights, championed environmental causes, and earned the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2014. Passing away in 2024 at age 96, her legacy endures through her descendants' social activism. This video delves deeply into her journey from an affluent young woman to a resilient activist, uncovering silent losses and her enduring influence. A story that will hold your attention to the very end. We think we know her. We see the photographs, the toothy, irrepressible grin, the wind-blown hair on a sailboat off Cape Cod, the trim figure standing loyally beside a man who carried the hopes of a generation. And we see the other photographs, the haunted face behind a black veil, a young mother with an impossible number of children clinging to her, a woman whose life was cleaved in two by a burst of violence in a hotel kitchen. But to see only these images is to miss the essence of the woman herself. Her story isn't just a supporting chapter in the Kennedy saga. It's a tale of its own, forged in new money, reckless energy, and profound Catholic faith, a story of a spirit so vibrant it could never be fully extinguished, even by the darkest of shadows. This is the story of the Kennedy who wasn't born a Kennedy, but who, in her heart and soul, may have been the most Kennedy of them all. To understand Ethel, you must first understand the Skakels. They were not the Kennedys. They didn't have the generations of accumulated wealth, the political pedigree, or the Boston Brahmin Polish. The Skakel story was a quintessentially American one, raw and recent. Ethel's father, George Skakel, was a force of nature. Born into poverty in Chicago, the son of a bricklayer, he was a self-made man who clawed his way to staggering wealth. He started as a railroad freight agent, earning a meager $15 a week, but he had an eye for opportunity and a relentless drive. He noticed that the coal industry was losing vast amounts of money from the dust that was lost during the transport, so he founded the Great Lakes Coal and Coke Company, pioneering a method to process this dust into valuable carbon. By the time Ethel was born on April 11, 1928, George Skakel was a titan of industry, a multimillionaire. But the Skakels were never quite accepted by the old money establishment. They were seen as boisterous, rough-edged, and a little too wild. They were devoutly, intensely Catholic, but their brand of faith was intertwined with a fiercely competitive, almost reckless approach to life. Their sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a place of organized chaos. Life was a contact sport. George Skakel encouraged his 7 children, 5 girls and 2 boys, to be fearless. They were taught to ride horses, ski treacherous slopes, and play rough-and-tumble sports with an almost religious fervor. Broken bones were a rite of passage. Their home life was a whirlwind of activity, competition, and noise, a stark contrast to the more reserved, politically calculated atmosphere of the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. Ethel, the 6th of the 7 children, was the embodiment of this Skakel spirit. She was vivacious, athletic, and possessed a mischievous streak that often got her into trouble. She was a superb equestrian and a passionate tennis player. She was also deeply, personally devout. Yet her piety didn't temper her rebellious nature. While attending the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, an institution known for its strict discipline, Ethel was a notorious prankster. In one infamous incident, she drove a motorcycle through the hallowed halls of the convent school. In another, she and a friend rode a horse into a campus elevator. It was this blend of sincere faith and untamable energy that would define her entire life. Tragedy, however, was as much a part of the Skakel legacy as wealth. Long before she would face the world as a widow, Ethel learned the brutal fragility of life. In 1955, in a story that seems like a dark premonition, a private plane carrying her parents, George and Ann Skakel, went down in a violent storm over Oklahoma. They were killed instantly. The vibrant, chaotic, loving center of the Skakel clan was gone. Ethel, then a young mother of 4, was devastated. This early, profound loss hardened her resolve and deepened her reliance on her faith. It also taught her a lesson she would have to recall in the most public way imaginable: that everything you love can be taken from you in an instant. This crucible of new money, aggressive competition, deep faith, and early grief is where the woman who would marry Robert F. Kennedy was forged. She was not a fragile porcelain doll. She was tempered steel. The meeting of Ethel Skakel and Robert F. Kennedy was not a storybook romance, at least not at first. It was a classic case of a girl falling for her sister's boyfriend. During a ski trip to Mont Tremblant in Quebec in the winter of 1945, Ethel, then just 17, met the shy, brooding younger brother of the charismatic Jack Kennedy. Bobby was there with Ethel's older sister, Patricia. Ethel, with her boundless energy and infectious laugh, was a stark contrast to the serious, often awkward Bobby. He was introspective and reserved. She was an explosion of life. Initially, Bobby was focused on Patricia, but fate and a bit of Ethel's signature Skakel recklessness intervened. Ethel, an expert skier, took a bad fall on the slopes, breaking her leg. Confined to her room, she became the center of a different kind of attention. Bobby, perhaps out of a sense of duty or simple kindness, began spending time with her. He would visit her, talk to her, and a new connection began to form. He was drawn to her spirit, her complete lack of artifice. She didn't seem to care that he was the quieter, less celebrated Kennedy brother. In fact, she seemed determined to pull him out of his shell. One friend later recalled, "Ethel was the only person I ever saw who could make Bobby Kennedy laugh, I mean really laugh." She saw past his reserved exterior to the passionate, fiercely loyal man within. Their courtship was a study in opposites attracting. He was methodical and serious. She was spontaneous and fun-loving. He was deeply devout in a quiet, intellectual way. Her faith was passionate and demonstrative. She challenged him, teased him, and filled his world with a kind of joyful chaos he had never known. She nicknamed him Black Robert, or the Little Black Beast, for his moods and intensity, but she did it with an affection that disarmed him. For his part, Bobby was utterly captivated. He wrote to a friend that Ethel was the most beautiful girl I have ever seen. They married on June 17th, 1950, at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich. Ethel Skakel was now Ethel Kennedy. She didn't just marry a man, she married a dynasty, and she threw herself into it with the same all-or-nothing energy she applied to everything in her life. The young couple moved to Washington, D.C., and soon bought a large, rambling estate in McLean, Virginia, known as Hickory Hill. Under Ethel's command, Hickory Hill became the vibrant, chaotic heart of the new Kennedy generation. It was a place where children, dogs, ponies, and even a pet seal named Sandy roamed freely. The pool was a legendary scene of boisterous parties and impromptu dunkings, where cabinet members and foreign dignitaries might find themselves thrown in, fully clothed, by a laughing Ethel or Bobby. Life at Hickory Hill was an extension of her Skakel upbringing, loud, competitive, and full of life. They had 11 children in 17 years, a testament to their Catholic faith and their shared love of a large, bustling family. Ethel was not a hands-off mother. She was the ringleader of the joyful mayhem. She organized ferocious touch football games on the lawn, legendary for their intensity. To be invited to play at Hickory Hill was to risk bruises and sprains, but it was also to be welcomed into the inner circle of power. Ethel was a fierce competitor, known for memorizing plays and showing no mercy to her opponents, regardless of their age or political standing. But behind the fun and games, she was a profoundly influential political partner to her husband. When Bobby was Attorney General in his brother's administration, Ethel was his staunchest defender and most enthusiastic cheerleader. She hosted countless events, charmed political allies, and stood as a fierce guardian of his reputation. She understood the world of power not as a delicate dance of diplomacy, but as a contact sport, and she played it with gusto. One rarely discussed incident reveals the depth of her protective loyalty. During the intense period of the Civil Rights Movement, Bobby Kennedy was facing immense pressure and criticism from all sides. At a tense dinner party, a prominent liberal journalist began to aggressively question and critique the administration's policies, directing his sharpest barbs at Bobby. The room grew silent and uncomfortable. Ethel, seated across the table, listened with a tightening jaw. Finally, having had enough, she stood up, picked up a full tureen of soup, walked over to the journalist, and poured it over his head. The act was shocking, undignified, and utterly Ethel. It was a raw, primal declaration. You do not attack my husband in my home. While it horrified the more staid members of Washington society, it sent a clear message. She was Bobby's immovable defender, his ultimate loyalist, a partner who would fight for him with every fiber of her being. This fierce, unwavering devotion would be the bedrock of their life together, a bond that would soon be tested by the most unimaginable sorrow. The world tilted on its axis on November 22, 1963. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas was a national trauma, a moment of collective heartbreak that shattered the illusion of American invincibility. For the Kennedy family, it was an intimate apocalypse. But for Robert and Ethel Kennedy, it was something more. It was the moment that thrust Bobby, the loyal younger brother, the tough attorney general, into the role of family patriarch and keeper of his brother's legacy. And it was the moment that Ethel watched her husband descend into a chasm of grief so profound it threatened to consume him. Bobby was utterly broken. The little black beast, the ruthless prosecutor, was hollowed out. He lost weight. His face became a gaunt mask of sorrow, and he would often wander for hours, lost in his thoughts. He retreated into himself, into a world of classical literature and philosophy, searching for answers that didn't exist. It was Ethel who had to hold the family and her husband together. While she was grieving deeply for the brother-in-law she adored, her focus was on Bobby. She had to be the strong one. She had to manage their sprawling, grieving family while trying to coax her husband back to the world of the living. A friend of the family, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., later wrote about this period with poignant insight. He described how Ethel would try to create small pockets of normalcy amidst the overwhelming sadness. She would insist on family dinners, encourage the children to play, and gently try to draw Bobby into conversations. But Schlesinger also noted something deeper. He believed that Ethel's steadfast, unwavering faith was a silent anchor for Bobby. She never wavered in her belief in God's plan, even when that plan seemed cruel and incomprehensible. In a way, her certainty gave him the space to have his doubts. She held the faith for both of them. One of the most revealing and rarely discussed stories from this period involves a quiet act of emotional rescue. Months after Dallas, Bobby remained lost in his sorrow. He had resigned as Attorney General and was aimless. One day, Ethel, sensing his deep despair, conspired with a few of Bobby's most trusted friends. They effectively orchestrated a challenge. They encouraged him to climb Mount Kennedy, a 14,000-foot peak in Canada's Yukon Territory that had been named in honor of his late brother. It was a grueling, dangerous undertaking, especially for a man in his physical and emotional state. Ethel knew it was a risk, but she also knew that her husband needed a monumental physical challenge to shock him out of his spiritual paralysis. She couldn't climb it with him, but she pushed him towards it. In March 1964, Bobby Kennedy, guided by Jim Whittaker, the first American to summit Mount Everest, made the arduous climb. When he reached the summit, he planted a flagpole bearing the Kennedy family crest. He left behind some of his brother's PT-109 tie clips and a copy of JFK's inaugural address. When he descended, he was a changed man. The physical ordeal had cauterized an emotional wound. He was still grieving, but he was no longer lost. He had found a purpose again. Ethel's gamble had paid off. She had understood better than anyone what her husband needed to begin healing. That healing transformed him. The grief, combined with his work fighting poverty and injustice, softened the hard edges of the once ruthless Attorney General. He became a more compassionate, empathetic figure, a champion for the marginalized and the dispossessed. And Ethel was right there with him, his partner in this new chapter. When he ran for the Senate from New York in 1964, she was a tireless campaigner, charming voters from Buffalo to Brooklyn. 4 years later, in 1968, that journey reached its zenith. Bobby announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States. It was a tumultuous, violent year for America, torn apart by the Vietnam War and racial strife. But Bobby's campaign felt like a beacon of hope. It was a vibrant, chaotic, and deeply personal crusade, and Ethel was at its very center. She was pregnant with their 11th child, but that didn't slow her down. She was on the campaign trail constantly, a whirlwind of energy, shaking hands, giving speeches, and connecting with people with her trademark authenticity. She was his greatest asset, a living symbol of the vitality and hope his campaign represented. They were a team, poised on the brink of reclaiming the dream that had been stolen from them in Dallas. And for a few short months, it seemed like anything was possible. They were winning. The hope was real. It was palpable. And it was carrying them all the way to California for the crucial primary, to a hotel called the Ambassador. The night of June 5th, 1968, should have been a celebration. Robert F. Kennedy had just won the pivotal California Democratic primary, a victory that put him on a clear path to the presidential nomination. In a crowded ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he delivered a speech filled with hope and unity, ending with the now haunting words, "My thanks to all of you. And now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." Ethel, 5 months pregnant with their daughter Rory, stood on the platform, beaming with pride, her face a portrait of joy and relief. After the speech, they were guided off the stage through a crowded kitchen pantry, a supposed shortcut to the press room. What happened next took only seconds but would echo for eternity. A series of sharp cracks like firecrackers pierced the celebratory noise. Pandemonium erupted. In the chaos, Ethel was pushed back, separated from her husband. When she finally fought her way through the screaming, panicked crowd, she saw him. Bobby was lying on the cold concrete floor, a rosary clutched in his hand, a pool of blood spreading beneath his head. The image of Ethel Kennedy in that moment is one of the most heartbreaking in modern history. Witnesses described how she immediately knelt beside him, her face a mask of disbelief and anguish. She cradled his head, whispering to him, trying to comfort him. Her first instinct, even in the face of this ultimate horror, was to protect him. When a well-meaning person tried to place a blanket over Bobby's head, Ethel gently but firmly pushed it away, a primal refusal to accept the finality of the moment. She stayed with him, her hand on his chest, her voice a low murmur until the paramedics arrived. One of his aides, the writer George Plimpton, remembered her absolute focus. Her face was set. There was no sign of panic. She was a soldier. She rode in the ambulance with him to the hospital, never leaving his side. For the next 26 hours, as he lay unconscious, she maintained a vigil outside his operating room. She greeted the stream of family and friends who arrived, her composure astonishing everyone. She was the calm at the center of a hurricane of grief, but it was a fragile, brutal calm. A close friend, observing her, said it was as if she had walled off a part of herself. At 1:44 a.m. on June 6, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. Ethel was a widow at 40 years old with 10 children and another on the way. The long journey home was a national spectacle of mourning. His casket was placed on a funeral train that traveled slowly from New York to Washington, D.C. Millions of Americans, black and white, rich and poor, lined the tracks to pay their last respects. Inside the train, Ethel sat in a private car, a solitary figure in black, receiving a stream of visitors who came to offer condolences. She was stoic, composed, and gracious, yet those closest to her could see the profound shock beneath the surface. She was performing the last public duty she would ever have as his wife. After the funeral at St. Patrick's Cathedral and the burial at Arlington National Cemetery, next to his brother Jack, Ethel returned to Hickory Hill. The house that had once been the epicenter of so much life, noise, and joy fell silent. The friends, the politicians, the reporters, they all eventually left. And Ethel Kennedy was alone, left to navigate an ocean of grief while raising 11 children, one of whom would never know her father. She had faced tragedy before, with the death of her parents. But this was different. This was the theft of a future, the violent extinguishing of a shared dream. The world watched, wondering how any human being could possibly endure it. The answer lay in the same qualities that had defined her all along: her ferocious loyalty, her unwavering faith, and a resilience forged in the fire of her Skakel upbringing. She would not collapse. She would carry on, because that is what Bobby would have expected her to do. It was now her sole mission to keep his memory and his cause alive. To understand Ethel Kennedy's life is to understand a woman of profound and sometimes challenging contradictions. Her public image was one of boundless energy, fierce loyalty, and devout faith. Yet beneath this surface lay a complex personality shaped by privilege, tragedy, and an intensely competitive spirit that could sometimes manifest in ways that were unsettling to others. History is not a simple story, and Ethel's life contains its share of controversies and debates that add necessary shadow and depth to her portrait. One of the most persistent, though perhaps mildest, critiques of Ethel centered on the very atmosphere she cultivated at Hickory Hill. While celebrated for its vitality and joy, some observers, and even some friends, quietly suggested that the chaos often bordered on neglect. With 11 children and a menagerie of animals, supervision was by necessity lax. Stories abound of children performing dangerous stunts, of a household in a constant state of disarray. To her defenders, this was simply the beautiful, boisterous reality of a large, loving family. To her critics, it reflected a certain recklessness, a belief that the normal rules of caution and propriety did not apply to them. It was a lifestyle that prioritized freedom and fearlessness above all else, a direct inheritance from her Skakel upbringing, but one that raised eyebrows in the more conventional world of Washington politics. Her competitiveness was also legendary, and not always in a charming way. She played to win in everything from touch football to tennis to simple parlor games. This drive was part of her charm, but it could also have a sharp edge. She could be demanding, impatient, and possessed a famously sharp tongue for those she felt were not measuring up. She did not suffer fools gladly, and her definition of a fool could be quite broad. This was the flip side of her fierce loyalty. If you were in her circle, she would defend you to the ends of the earth. If you were on the outside, or if you crossed her or her family, you could face the full force of her formidable will. The most significant and damaging controversy to touch Ethel's life, however, came not from her own actions, but from those of her family. It dragged the Skakel name, and by extension her own, into a dark and disturbing criminal case, the murder of Martha Moxley. In 1975, the 15-year-old Moxley was brutally murdered in the exclusive Bellhaven neighborhood of Greenwich, Connecticut, the very same neighborhood where Ethel grew up. The prime suspects from the beginning were two of Ethel's nephews, Tommy and Michael Skakel, the sons of her brother Rushton. For decades, the case went cold, a dark secret hanging over the wealthy community. But in the late 1990s, the investigation was reopened, fueled by new books and renewed media interest. The focus eventually settled on Michael Skakel. Throughout the long and public ordeal that followed, which culminated in Michael's conviction for murder in 2002, Ethel's position was one of absolute, unwavering loyalty to her nephew. She steadfastly proclaimed his innocence, attended court proceedings to show her support, and used her considerable influence to rally public opinion to his side. To many outsiders, her stance was baffling, even galling. The evidence against Michael, though circumstantial, was compelling. To the Moxley family and their supporters, Ethel's fierce defense of her nephew felt like an insult, another example of a powerful family closing ranks to protect one of its own, no matter the cost. But to understand Ethel's perspective is to understand the core tenet of her entire life: family above all else. In her mind, her nephew was being persecuted, and it was her duty as a Skakel and as the matriarch of her clan to stand by him. It presented a deep moral complexity. Is loyalty a virtue when it is extended in the face of a terrible crime? For Ethel, the answer was unequivocal. Her loyalty was not conditional. It was absolute. The controversy did not tarnish the memory of Robert Kennedy, but it did complicate the public perception of Ethel, casting a shadow of doubt on the judgment and moral clarity of the woman who was the keeper of his flame. It revealed in the starkest possible terms the unbreakable and to some unsettling power of tribal loyalty that governed her world. In the desolate aftermath of 1968, Ethel Kennedy faced a choice. She could retreat from the world, a tragic figure defined forever by her loss, and raise her children in private seclusion. No one would have blamed her. Instead, she chose a far more difficult path. She chose to transform her personal grief into a public mission. She would not let her husband's life be defined by its violent end, but by the ideals for which he fought. This decision would shape the rest of her life and become her most enduring historical significance. Just months after Bobby's death, with the help of family and friends, Ethel established the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial. It was later renamed the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights, a name that more accurately reflected its ambitious and global mission. This was not to be a passive stone and marble monument. It was conceived as a living legacy, an organization dedicated to advancing the causes that had been closest to Bobby's heart in his final years: civil rights, social justice, and human rights for the oppressed around the world. Ethel was the driving force behind its creation and its moral compass for decades. The center became a pioneering force in the human rights movement. It established awards to honor courageous journalists, authors, and human rights activists who, often at great personal risk, spoke truth to power. Ethel personally presided over these ceremonies for years, lending her unique moral authority and the powerful Kennedy name to dissidents and changemakers from every corner of the globe. The center also developed innovative programs in litigation advocacy and education, fighting for everything from the rights of farm workers in the United States to the end of apartheid in South Africa. When Nelson Mandela was finally released from prison, one of a small select group of people he specifically asked to meet with was Ethel Kennedy. In that meeting, he thanked her for her steadfast support, acknowledging the crucial role the RFK Center had played in keeping the global pressure on the apartheid regime. Through this work, Ethel ensured that Robert Kennedy's name became synonymous not with tragedy, but with a global fight for a newer world, as he had once called it. She leveraged her unique position, the widow of a fallen hero, not for sympathy, but for action. She traveled the world, often to dangerous and politically unstable regions, meeting with activists, comforting political prisoners, and using her presence to shine a media spotlight on injustice. She did this not as a politician, but as a private citizen, a mother and a widow, with a profound sense of duty. Her other, more private legacy was her children. Raising 11 children alone, under the intense glare of the public eye, was a monumental task. The Kennedy name was both a blessing and a curse, opening doors but also inviting intense scrutiny and impossibly high expectations. The family endured further heartbreaking tragedies. 2 of her sons, David and Michael, died young. David from a drug overdose in 1984, and Michael in a skiing accident in 1997. These losses were devastating blows, renewing the talk of a Kennedy curse. Yet Ethel persevered, her faith once again serving as her unbreakable shield. Despite the sorrows, she also saw her children carry on the family tradition of public service. Her eldest, Kathleen, became Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Joseph served in the U.S. Congress. And her youngest, Rory, born 6 months after her father's death, became an acclaimed documentary filmmaker, often focusing on subjects of social and political importance. Through them, the ideals of both their father and their relentlessly dedicated mother continued to find expression. Ethel Kennedy's ultimate significance lies in her role as a bridge. She was the bridge between the boisterous, new money world of the Skakels and the political dynasty of the Kennedys. She was the bridge between the buoyant hope of the early 1960s and the harsh realities that followed. Most importantly, she was the bridge between Robert Kennedy's life and his legacy. She refused to let his story end in that hotel kitchen. She took the shattered pieces of a dream and built from them an enduring institution dedicated to justice. In doing so, she taught a powerful lesson about the nature of grief and resilience. She demonstrated that it is possible to carry an immense private sorrow while still fighting for a better public world. She is not just a footnote in the Kennedy story. She is the author of its most crucial, poignant, and resilient chapter. There are lives of such intense brightness and such profound darkness that they seem to belong more to fiction than to history. Ethel Skakel Kennedy's life is one of them. It is a story that sweeps from the boisterous, joyful chaos of Hickory Hill to the cold, concrete floor of a hotel pantry. It is a story of a woman who embraced life with a ferocity that was both dazzling and at times daunting. She began as a Skakel, forged in a world of fierce competition, new money, and an unapologetic, almost rowdy Catholic faith. She was a force of nature who found her match in a man who was her opposite in temperament, but her equal in passion and conviction. Together, she and Bobby Kennedy were more than just a political power couple. They were a true partnership, a team that seemed poised to inherit and redefine the American dream. She was the laughter to his seriousness, the energy to his introspection, the unwavering believer who helped pull him back from the abyss of grief. And then, in a flash of violence, she became something else entirely, the keeper of a legacy. She was left alone, a young widow with a nation's hopes and her own 11 children to carry forward. The choices she made in the crushing silence that followed the crowds and the cameras are what truly define her. She chose not to be a victim of her story, but to be the author of its next chapter. By creating the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights, she transformed her personal tragedy into a global force for good, ensuring her husband's name would forever be linked not with his death, but with the tireless pursuit of a more just and gentle world. Her life was never simple or serene. It was marked by controversy, by the sharp edges of her own competitive nature, and by further unimaginable family sorrows. Yet through it all, two things remained constant: her unbreakable faith and her absolute loyalty. She lived by a code that was, at its core, deeply human. It was a code of showing up, of standing by your people, of fighting for what you believe in, and of finding the strength somehow to get up one more time than you are knocked down. Ethel Kennedy's story is not just a tale of surviving tragedy. It is a powerful, poignant, and deeply human testament to the enduring strength of a spirit that simply refused to be extinguished. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.